Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and welcome to another Ummatic colloquium. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all from all corners of the Ummah to a discussion of the Cyber Umma, appropriately an online discussion, entitled Cyber Umma, Algorithmic Hegemony and Digital Decolonization, with our distinguished speaker, Dr. Sahab Khamis. It's a great pleasure to have a scholar of great expertise zooming in from the United States. And we look forward to a lengthy presentation followed by the opportunity for all of us to put questions to our expert speaker. And inshallah, without further ado, I'll begin by introducing the topic very briefly. Can Muslims move beyond fragmented hashtags and fleeting online outrage to build a shared digital future rooted in Islamic principles and civilizational vision? This session explores how the digital realm, once a catalyst for national uprisings like the Arab Spring, might now be reclaimed as a space for transnational ummatic unity. It examines the urgent need to confront the growing challenges of algorithmic bias and platform censorship, while exploring digital decolonization as a necessary strategy for reclaiming discursive agency. It also asks how Muslims might use these very platforms to engage one another across political and theological lines without deepening division. We explore the potential to nurture an authentic ummatic identity online, one that reflects not only the common grievances, but also common aspirations. Finally, the conversation hopes to address the critical question of practice. How can this emerging cyber ummah bridge the digital and real world divide to achieve coordinated, tangible outcomes? And thus, it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Sahab, who is an award-winning scholar specializing in Arab and Muslim media, and serves as an associate professor of communication and affiliate professor of women's studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is the former head of the Department of Mass Communication at Qatar University. Dr. Khamis is the author and co-author of several influential works, including Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, and another work, Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement, and Citizen Journalism. Her scholarship explores the role of media in shaping Muslim public discourses and advancing value-based communication across the Ummah. She is currently president of the Arab-US Association for Communication Educators and a leading voice in the global conversation on Islamic identity, digital power, and social transformation. Inshallah, this discussion and subsequent Q&A session will be moderated by myself, Usama Al-Azami, of Hamad bin Khalifa University, and we welcome audience participation. You will see a chat bar on the right of the live stream on YouTube, which you can type into with your questions, and we will pick up on these in the second hour, inshallah. But without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Sahab and give the floor to you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Osama. Jazakumullah khair for this kind and generous introduction. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be with you and your team and your guests in this important session of Ummatics. I did watch some of your previous sessions online and some of the previous colloquiums, and I was very impressed by the quality of the guests and the quality of the discussion and the Q&A. It was really very interesting and intellectually stimulating, and I really hope that this session will also add to the intellectually stimulating, useful, and constructive colloquia that you are organizing as part of Ummatic. So thank you so much for the invitation, and thanks to you and your team for all your good efforts to make it happen.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jazakumullah khair. And thanks, of course, to all the audience who are joining us online and are going to be enriching the conversation with their questions later on after I finish my presentation and I finish also my Q&A and discussion with you Dr. Osama. And with that said, if we can be kind enough to pull up the slides of my presentation, that would be greatly appreciated, please. Thank you so much. So I would like to start by talking about my first co-authored book, Islam.com: Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, as providing a platform or some kind of intro into discussing some of the topics that Dr. Osama mentioned in his kind introduction. Where do we stand today in terms of the digital ummah online, the ummah in cyberspace? How can we think about issues such as unity or diversity, divergence or conformity? How can we think of bringing together the ummah online and also in the real world? What are the challenges and the barriers which still exist? So I will try to tie in some of these issues to the discussion of my book, Islam.com: Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, which was co-authored by myself and Dr. Muhammad Nawawi. Next slide, please. So first of all, I'd like to talk about why this book, what made us really encouraged to write this book in the first place. First of all, there was the changing political landscape after the events of 9/11, stereotypes and misrepresentations and misconceptions about Islam and Muslims started to spread, and the need for hearing Muslims' voices in their own words is very, very important. So it is no secret that a lot of what has been written about Muslims and Islam has been written by quote unquote non-Muslims. And myself and my co-author, being two Muslim scholars living and studying and teaching and researching in the West, felt the important need to fill this void. In other words, for Muslims to speak about their own faith, about their own ummah, in their own voices and in their own intellectual work and their own words is extremely important. And it became more so, of course, after all the stereotypes and misconceptions about Islam and Muslims, which started to spread, especially after the unfortunate events of 9/11. Also, the changing media landscape. New media enabled platforms for individual and collective expressions away from governments and from those in power. In other words, the emergence of what we call citizen journalism. Now, for those of you who are maybe not familiar with the term, citizen journalism refers to any kind of journalism using online and social media tools to express the views of ordinary lay people who are outside of quote unquote institutional organizations, whether they are religious institutions or whether they are political institutions or educational institutions. They're just lay people, ordinary people sharing their thoughts and ideas. And this phenomena of citizen journalism became enabled in the age of new media and digital media in particular, bringing about a whole host of pros and cons. Yes, there is more diversity. Yes, there is more, different views being expressed online, plurality. But there is also, as we're going to discuss in a moment, a lot of polarization, a lot of people who cannot meet halfway. It's either my way or the highway. If you disagree with me, you automatically become the enemy. And citizen journalism, in some cases, does not help to bridge some of these gaps or some of these divides. Quite the opposite. In some cases, it even increases online, as we're going to discuss in a moment. Also, very little research has been conducted on Islamic websites. Most of this research focused on the so-called quote unquote, although of course I don't like the term and we can definitely take it with a grain of salt and disagree with it, jihadist or extremist websites rather than moderate or mainstream websites. In other words, instead of talking about everyday Muslims, what do everyday Muslims say to each other in cyberspace? What do they say to each other as Muslims belonging to different sects and different groups? And what do they say to non-Muslims in cyberspace or online? Unfortunately, especially after 9/11, we started to see a lot of focus on quote unquote things like radicalization, extremism, terrorism studies. A whole new discipline and area of study started to emerge, focusing on the extremes rather than the mainstream. And therefore, myself and my co-author wanted to fill this void by focusing on quote unquote the mainstream. What are ordinary, average Muslims saying to each other in cyberspace? And we deliberately stayed away from some of these quote-unquote tones of radicalization or extremism or so-called terrorism studies, which started to dominate the US academy and Western academy at large, especially after 9/11. So that was another reason for us to write this book. Next slide, please. The online Muslim landscape. Today, there are thousands and thousands of Islamic websites. Some were launched by authoritative religious figures and clerics as virtual extensions of conventional Islamic institutions, such as Al-Azhar in Egypt, for example, while others are simply attempts by ordinary individuals with no formal religious education or training to create an online public space of discourse and discussion about Islam and Muslims. In other words, you have a very hybrid online space today. And you have many different orientations, many different trends, many different degrees of religious knowledge or lack of religious knowledge, really exhibiting themselves online. You see some platforms that are opened by traditional institutions of religious knowledge, such as Al-Azhar and others, trying to present fatwa or religious advice by trained and authoritative scholars and clerics. But you also see in parallel ordinary people, average people, everyday people, in many cases do not have the proper training or knowledge, still sharing their opinions and their views, and sometimes even their fatwa, which might not be very well informed or based on authoritative knowledge. And that, of course, brings a whole body of threats and dangers in and of itself. The promise of online democratization and activating civil society through multiple voices. When the internet was first introduced, one of the very big promises was it's going to become a hub for democracy. Some people went as far as saying, oh, just give people the internet and they're going to have democracy. Just give the people the internet and they're going to have freedom. And I think that Dr. Osama in the introduction mentioned maybe the Arab Spring and how people were so hopeful that, now people can use Facebook and blogs and Twitter and all of that stuff, and now they can bring about real change. Of course, fast forward from 2011 to 2025, we are talking about 14 years, and we are seeing that, unfortunately, that has not been the case. So the internet, I always think of it as a catalyst, as an amplifier of voices of reform and democratization and change and democratic transition. But could it be the magic stick that can change things around? Absolutely not. Could it be sufficient in and of itself to bring about the needed civil discourse, constructive discussion, let alone actual democratic change in the real world? The answer is no. You need much more than that. You need to have this kind of bridge between the online and the offline, between what happens in cyberspace and what happens in the real world. You need to build civil society. You need to build opposition parties. You need to build a democratic system. And then the internet and social media platforms can come in as a supplementary factor to aid and to help all of these processes, but it cannot bring about these kinds of desired changes all by itself. And that is a very important point that I hope maybe we can elaborate on even further in the Q&A, inshallah. Also, the threat of uninformed religious advice or fatwa from online muftis in cyberspace. Some of these online muftis are not even qualified, as we just mentioned a moment ago, to give the proper religious fatwa or proper religious advice, simply because they were not trained to do so. They did not acquire the proper religious training or knowledge in order to be able to give the fatwa, yet they might present themselves online as very authoritative figures, and a lot of people who go online do not know the difference. And these are some of the threats of cyberspace and the threats of digital realities today, that we have this hybrid reality, very diverse. Some people will say diversity is a good thing. Yes, I agree, but we also have to have what we call media literacy. Media literacy means you have to have the proper training, awareness, to be able to tell the difference between what is real and what is not, what is authoritative and what is not authoritative, what is based on real knowledge and what is not based on real knowledge. So you need to have, in my opinion, both media literacy and digital literacy on one hand, and also religious literacy and Islamic literacy at the same time in order to be able to navigate this cyberspace safely and productively and constructively. Next slide, please. So, about this book, what impact do Islamic websites have on mainstream Islamic discourses? These are some of the questions myself and my co author tried to ask or to pose in this book. What are the patterns of these sites' discourses within the realm of the quote unquote virtual Ummah, or the Islamic community in cyberspace and the Islamic community in the digital age? How far do these sites act as a platform for the display of collective identity in cyberspace or divergent identities in cyberspace? In other words, how far do they reflect a spirit of unity and consensus and agreement, and how far do they represent a spirit of polarization, fragmentation, and divergence across the Muslim Ummah? How do these sites contribute to the creation of an Islamic public sphere or Islamic public spheres in the plural? These are just some of the questions that myself and my co author tried to pose in this book. And many of these questions, in my opinion, are still very valid today. We're still asking the very same questions today, and we are still trying to find answers for them. Next slide, please. So one theoretical framework that myself and my colleague used in this book was the Habermasian public sphere. I'm not sure if some of you are familiar with it, but it is a sphere between civil society and the state in which critical public discussions of matters of general interest take place. That was the description or the definition that the German philosopher Habermas gave for this quote-unquote ideal public sphere. Bourgeoisie public sphere is rational, critical, opens debates and discussions about issues of common public interest to reach an informed consensus. This is how he, envisioned this public sphere in a very idealistic way. Of course, as we're going to talk about it in a moment, the discussions and debates in the digital sphere online, as it pertains to the Muslim Ummah today, really is not representative of this ideal quote-unquote Habermasian public sphere. It is very different, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Also, a sphere outside of the realm of state control. It is not controlled by the state. It's a Habermasian notion of communicative action. People are communicating in a very deliberate, meaningful, constructive way about matters of public interest and public importance. And the public sphere is based on notions of universality, equality, and accessibility. Let me remind you here also that the internet, when it was first introduced, a lot of people saw in it not just the promise of democratization and reform that we talked about a moment ago, but some people also saw the promise of universality, equality, egalitarianism, and accessibility. In other words, everybody is going to have equal access to the internet. Everybody is going to have an equal voice in the internet. Now, the big question, is that really the case today? My answer to that is absolutely not, because the internet has not always been a space for liberation. In some cases, it can even be a space for repression. In other words, yes, we have seen some, freedom fighters and opponents of authoritarian regimes and activists, trying to use the internet in order to spread ideas such as, calling for democracy and for reform. But guess what? Authoritarian and repressive regimes are also using the internet and cyberspace in order to repress and suppress voices of dissent, diversity, democratization, and reform. And in many cases, they're now becoming more technologically savvy. They're able to master the tools and the skills in order to crush dissent online and offline, and to repress the different voices of diversity and democratization. So that is something we have to bear in mind, that cyberspace and the internet, as I always call it, is a tool. It all depends on what are you doing with this tool. You can use it for liberation and democratization, but it can also be used exactly in the opposite direction in order to increase repression and hegemony and control over voices of dissent and voices of democratization. So we have to be aware of that. Also, is it truly universal? Is it truly egalitarian? Is it truly accessible to everyone around this world? Again, the answer is no. We have what we call the digital divide. The digital divide means the gap between the technological haves and have nots. Those who have access to 24/7 high speed internet and have access to digital literacy, and those who are deprived of all of that. So, what does that mean? It means that not everybody has universal, egalitarian, equal access to cyberspace. There are also discrepancies. There are also differences. There is also a digital divide. And we have to be aware of these realities when we talk about the realities of the Ummah in cyberspace or the digital Ummah today. Next slide, please. So the Islamic public sphere or public spheres, what kind of similarities or differences exist between the secular Western notion of the Habermasian public sphere and the public spheres in an Islamic context, both online and offline? The term that can be used to describe the Islamic public sphere today is public Islam, as some scholars refer to it, and members of public Islam participate in open discussions and debates of various issues in a way that leads to achieving al-maslaha al-amma, or the common good, through engaging in shura or consultation. Sometimes they may reach ijma' or consensus, and they're also encouraged to exercise ijtihad or interpretation. I'm trying here to draw some parallels between the Islamic, the so-called quote-unquote Islamic public sphere as it exists in cyberspace, and the quote-unquote ideal notion of deliberation and discussion as envisioned by Habermas. I was teaching a course on Islam in the digital age as a visiting scholar at the University of Chicago back in 2014. And one student asked me, it was a very intelligent question, why use the Habermasian public sphere, which is a Western concept, in order to study the realities of the Muslim Ummah? And would it have been possible to maybe avoid using Western theories altogether? That was a very intelligent and a very smart question. And I told the student, I'm so happy that he asked this question, because in reality, myself and my co-author showed in this book that we can use some Western concepts and theories to understand and unpack Muslim realities today. That doesn't mean that we have to buy into these Western theories in a holistic sense. In other words, we have to decolonize Muslim thought today, and decolonization is one of the main themes and one of the main points that we want to discuss together today as it relates to the realities of the Muslim Ummah, online and offline. That doesn't mean we have to necessarily always avoid Western thought or Western theories or Western scholars. We can just basically take whatever is useful, whatever is helpful, and then also discuss the similarities and differences. Where do they overlap? Where do they differ? Where do they conform? Where do they diverge? In other words, we have to adopt a critical lens that allows us to look at what some of these Western scholars is saying, but in a critical lens that allows us to take whatever is suitable for our Muslim Ummah and Muslim realities, and maybe to avoid or to negotiate some of the notions and themes which could be different or divergent from our own identity as Muslims. Next slide, please. So also let's talk about the Muslim community today and the community also in cyberspace. So what is the Muslim Ummah, what is the Muslim reality, and what is the Ummah all about? The Ummah is a community of believers that brings together not only the Muslims currently living on earth, but also all past and future generations. So the term Ummah in and of itself is a very holistic, very encompassing term. We have to understand it in that sense. It encompasses the past and the present and the future. So any person who is a member of the Muslim Ummah is going to be included under this definition of Ummah, whether they lived in the past or they're now living in the present or even are going to be living in future generations. Members of the Ummah have a sense of spiritual union that is nurtured by their participation in the same religious practices, such as Hajj. So the practice of Hajj or pilgrimage, for example, brings about not just the abstract notion of the Ummah, but turns this abstract notion of Ummah into a physical reality. That's where you see millions of people coming from every corner of the world, from different races, different ethnicities, different genders, skin colors, you name it, but they're all unified in the practice of pilgrimage or Hajj, and they're all unified in this moment to represent, in a very literal sense, the unity of the Ummah. So it's not just an abstract idea, it actually turns into a real idea in the real world in moments like the Jum'ah prayer or during the Hajj or the pilgrimage. The Ummah as a community encompasses Muslims living in Muslim majority societies as well as non-Muslim societies. So nowadays we have more and more Muslims living in the West, like myself, like my co-author, and many others. They're living in the diaspora. They're living outside of their home countries. And they're also part of the Muslim Ummah. So whether you are living in a Muslim majority country or whether you are living in non-Muslim majority countries in the diaspora, you are still part of this umbrella of the Muslim Ummah. And the Ummah encompasses the dimensions of universality and equality. So in a truly universal sense, egalitarian sense, the Ummah is a universal and equitable space. It's really bringing about these notions of universality and equality in a real sense, in a literal sense, for those who are part of this Ummah. And that is something that the Habermasian public sphere is not able to accomplish, because the Habermasian public sphere has been criticized for being, quote unquote, too bourgeoisie, too elitist. It is very exclusive. Oh, you have to be from the upper middle class. You have to be highly educated. You have to be, in many cases, a white man in order to be part of this Habermasian public sphere. So that has been one of the critiques of the Habermasian public sphere. It's exclusive, elitist, bourgeoisie, leaves out a lot of people. That is not the case with the Muslim Ummah, that really embodies the values of universality and accessibility and equality. And that's why I'm saying when we use Western theoretical frameworks, we have to use them with a grain of salt. We have to use them critically in order to see what fits our Muslim reality and what does not. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So what are the challenges facing the Muslim Ummah today? So myself and my co-author brought about 3 challenges that, in my opinion, are still alive and well. They're still very much representing challenges to the Muslim Ummah today. The challenge of democratization. Most governments in Muslim countries are still predominantly, unfortunately, authoritarian regimes. How far can new voices and oppositional voices be heard? Again, that brings us back full circle to the discussion about what happened in the Arab Spring, for example, when some young people, some young activists tried to use online tools like Facebook and blogs and Twitter to push the envelope and to bring about change and reform and democratization. But like I said earlier, we have to think of cyberspace as a tool that can be used both ways, can be used for hegemony and repression, and can be used for resistance and liberation. So the democratization challenge is still alive and well, and it does pose a challenge for the Muslim Ummah up till now. Another challenge is the dialogue challenge. Especially after 9/11, how far can members of the Muslim Ummah engage in constructive dialogue with others with a capital O, meaning non-Muslims in different parts of the world? And I would say that even dialogue within the Muslim Ummah is a challenge. It's not just the challenge of dialogue with others who are different from you or belonging to a different sect or a different religion. Even within the same community and within the same Ummah, there are still challenges to having constructive, useful, effective dialogue. And these are some things we really need to talk about. What can we do in order to bring about more constructive, useful, positive, and meaningful dialogue between Muslims and non-Muslims, and between Muslims and other Muslims as well? And there is also the diaspora challenge. Due to the global nature of the Muslim Ummah, how far can Muslims in the diaspora remain connected to the rest of the Muslim community everywhere? And I will add to that also, how well can they connect to their new societies? In other words, when you talk about Muslims in increasing numbers who are now living in Europe, who are now living in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in other parts of the world, how far can they maintain useful, effective discussion and connection to their home countries, the Muslim majority countries, but also how far can they have constructive links and dialogue and connections and bridges with their new societies, the societies in which they're now living. These are also real challenges. So these 3Ds, as we can call them, right? The democratization challenge, the dialogue challenge, and the diaspora challenge, in my opinion, are still alive and well, and they still pose big challenges to the Muslim Ummah, both online and offline, in cyberspace, as well as in the real world and in everyday life. Next slide, please. So now we talked about the concept of the Ummah. What about the concept of the digital or virtual Ummah, right? That's a very important concept to discuss and to talk about, and it relates to the theme of our discussion today. So the internet as a transformative technology has bridged geographical barriers among many Muslims. This is true, that the internet is borderless, right? It does not know any geographic borders, right? I'm now in Silver Spring, Maryland, in the United States, and I'm talking to some colleagues in Qatar, and some of you are joining from different parts of the world. So the internet bridges the geographic boundaries and borders, and therefore helps to bring about some kind of transnational idea. Of course, that can relate to the notion of a transnational digital or virtual ummah as well. The internet has allowed for a wider range of voices to enter the public sphere and to articulate different understandings of Islam. This idea of plurality, of diversity, which I believe is a very healthy phenomena, to have different views and different ideas. When does it become unhealthy? When the pluralization turns into polarization. And polarization means we cannot meet each other halfway. We cannot meet in the middle. Our views and opinions become so far apart that we cannot see any room for negotiation or compromise, and that is a dangerous phenomenon. And I think you would agree with me that this notion of polarization is becoming a reality in many political contexts inside and outside of the Muslim world. We are seeing this polarization, for example, in the political realities in the United States and many parts of the West. So it is not just about Muslims, it is also for many, many different communities and countries all over the world. Participation in the virtual ummah can be identityless. You know how some people use anonymity online? So they go online and they can call themselves anything, the Golden Knights or the Pink Princess or the Blossoming Flower. They can just give themselves all of these nicknames and fake names and fake accounts. And of course, that can bring a whole host of threats and dangers, because when people hide behind the curtain of anonymity, they can be offensive, they can be abrasive, they can attack others, they can become very polarized, they can have very severe conflicting views, and it becomes hard to control these phenomena. And that is something that we also have to pay attention to and talk about as well. The virtual ummah or digital ummah allowed for collective Islamic consciousness online. We're going to talk about that in a second when we talk about the sense of consensus or unity, that there are some issues, such as the issue of Palestine, for example, that can bring Muslims together in a unified sense. But then you have other issues where you're going to see a lot of diversions and even in some cases, polarization. The reimagination and reconceptualization of the Muslim Ummah online is illustrated in the Muslims' deliberations on various Islamic websites. So when you see Muslims deliberating and discussing and talking and conversing online, you see also this concept of quote unquote the digital Ummah or virtual Ummah, which, as we're going to talk about it in a second, has its own pros and cons. You're going to see a lot of consensus, a lot of uniformity, but you're also going to see a lot of differences and a lot of divergence, and in some extreme cases, even polarization online as well. Next slide, please. So the mainstream Islamic websites, they provide platforms for the exchange of ideas between various participants around issues of common concern to all Muslims. Most of these websites' audience are young Muslims whose lives are largely shaped by new media, particularly the internet, and there are both similarities and differences between these websites. We have to bear in mind the demographic element, the generational element, and that is true up till now as we speak. Who are the avid users of the internet or cyberspace or digital media or new media? Definitely, they are young people, the young generations. And this is very important because these young people are in many cases in their formative years. They're still forming their ideas, their thoughts about the world, and also about their own Muslim identities as young Muslims, right? And therefore, these websites, when there's so many and you have all of this hybridity and all of this diversity online, some of which bringing authoritative, traditional, knowledge, which is truly based on authentic Islamic knowledge, and some of which is just by lay people who have not been trained in the proper Islamic training or do not have the proper Islamic knowledge. It brings about a whole host of opportunities as well as threats and challenges, especially for the younger generation. Not to mention also some of the things that have been brought up in the introduction by Dr. Osama, such as the idea that you can have certain algorithmic domination or repression, right? We cannot assume that everybody in this world is free to share whatever they want to share online without any filters, without any controls, without any form of mechanisms that might suppress some voices at the expense of others. There is always this mechanism of algorithmic hegemony and control. We saw that, for example, very clearly in postings about the Gaza war, or what is going on in Gaza. We have seen some activists who are trying to, maybe share some content which is showing the realities of what's happening in Gaza. But we also saw some Facebook accounts being closed or shut down for this reason. We have seen some accounts being deleted altogether for this reason. We have seen, for example, Twitter, which is now called X, suppressing also some of these voices, in some cases allowing visibility for some posts over others. And that led some scholars and critics and activists to leave Twitter or X altogether and to migrate to a new platform like Blue Sky. So these hegemonic, controls are there, and we have to admit that they are there, and we have to find ways in order to get around them and find effective strategies to deal with them. Next slide, please. So myself and my co-author talked about three basic websites or Islamic websites in this book: islamonline.net, islamway.com, and amrkhalid.net. And we'll try to give a brief idea about each one of them and how they were similar, how they are different, just as a way to link to our discussion and conversation about the realities of the virtual ummah. Of course, you have to bear in mind that these are not, quote unquote, representative of the entire discussions and deliberations online. Myself and my co-author were very clear to say that we chose them because they were among the three most visited websites that had the most traffic, but in no sense and in no way are they, quote unquote, representative or generalizable to the entire Muslim discussions and deliberations online. They're not meant to be representative or generalizable, and that is the case with qualitative research in general. You can only give people a snapshot of reality, but you cannot claim that this is representative or generalizable in any way, shape, or form. Next slide, please. So islamonline.net, it was established in 1997 as one of the leading Muslim sites on the internet. The site aims to promote a unified and lively Islam that keeps up with modern times in all areas. It was established thanks to the encouragement of the prominent Sufi Muslim preacher, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, rahmatullah alayh. And of course, there were others who also helped him to found Islam Online. And they tried to really have this kind of platform that addresses modern issues that might be affecting young people, young generations, when they ask questions and they want to find answers to some of these questions. And instead of going to, quote unquote, completely secular or non-Islamic websites, Islam Online tried to provide some answers to some of these controversies and some of these questions in using even different languages. So there were more than one language, linguistic diversity, to try to reach as wide of an audience as possible online. Next slide, please. There's also amrkhalid.net. It was launched in 2002 by Amr Khalid, an Egyptian-born accountant turned preacher. So some people were saying this guy, unlike, for example, Sheikh Qaradawi, who was a Muslim cleric, of course, he was not a Muslim cleric. Amr Khalid was a young man. He was an accountant. Some people called him a Muslim televangelist. He had huge popularity, particularly among the young people, the young demographic, 15 to 35 age group, and women and young people across the Arab world. He was a lay reformer and one of the new religious intellectuals because he did not come from, quote unquote, a traditional religious institution like Al-Azhar. He was not trained in a formal traditional sense. He was simply a young man trying to reach out to other young people in a way that they can easily understand and relate to. And that, of course, brought about a lot of praise, but also a lot of criticism, as you can imagine. Some people said, yes, we need some of these young scholars, some of these young people. And nowadays, of course, you can see a lot of these young scholars as well online. I'm sure you know many of them, Yasmin Mujahid and all of these young people also trying to reach, especially young people online. And some people say, wait a minute, were these people trained in quote unquote authoritative traditional religious institutions or not? So there is also mixed feelings about this phenomena, but no matter what you think about it, it was successful in reaching young people in particular. Next slide, please. And the third website we talked about in this book was islamway.com. It follows, quote unquote, the traces of al-Salaf al-Salih, or the righteous predecessors, and it aims at providing a sound and clearer perception of Islam. It has no affiliation to any political or religious group or any kind of governmental sponsorship or guardianship. The exact founders were unspecified, unlike the two other websites where you see who founded Islam Online and who founded Amr Khalid. Islam Way tried to stay away from any kind of quote unquote affiliation to a particular political, religious, or a governmental body. And it just said we are an independent group of people trying to present some kind of Islamic knowledge online to help provide awareness and knowledge to Muslims. And its discussion forums are confined to Muslim sisters only, leading to largely social topics. So the Islam Way Sisters was a discussion forum on islamway.com, which interestingly provided a specifically gendered space for women from inside and outside the Muslim world, those who are living in Muslim majority countries and those who are living in the diaspora, to engage in some kind of discussions in a sisterly fashion, which is specifically focused on gendered issues. I'm a new Muslima and I just put on the hijab and I live in Germany and I'm a convert. I'm finding a lot of challenges. So the sisters will jump in the Islam Way Sisters discussion forum and say things like, congratulations, sister, and welcome. And this is great. Mabruk. We are so happy for you. Congratulations. And they can provide her with some kind of emotional support and some kind of useful tips in order to deal with her reality as a convert who just embraced Islam, living in Germany, and she just decided to put on the hijab or the Islamic headscarf. Or a woman will say, I'm living in the diaspora, I'm finding a hard time raising my children in a non-Muslim country. Do you have any useful tips or advice or ideas for me to help me to raise my children in Canada or in the US? And then sisters will jump in and try to provide advice. So the interesting part here was the gendered safe space that was created in the Islam Way Sisters website. And I'm sure now there are more of these websites. I have, for example, one of my colleagues who wrote about the phenomena of the niqabosphere, which is very interesting. The niqabosphere being this online space in cyberspace where sisters who wear the niqab or the face veil, they find also some kind of space for themselves to engage among each other and to talk about issues which are specifically of relevance to them as niqabis or sisters who wear the niqab or the face veil in also cyberspace and in online discussions. So you see more of these realities now emerging in cyberspace, which is very interesting. Next slide, please. So what are some of the things that we have noticed and have seen here? Threads from the Arabic forums of Islam Online, Islam Way, and Amr Khalid reflected a strong sense of collective consciousness that emanates from both Arab and Islamic identities. That reflected consensus, but did not necessarily exemplify a Habermasian public sphere or an Islamic ijtihad and shura concept. Let me explain this point. So we have seen, as the findings of this book clearly show, and that relates, in my opinion, to a lot of the realities that we are seeing today in cyberspace as well, that on one hand, you can have the emotional consensus. In other words, people will relate to certain issues, such as supporting Al-Aqsa or supporting the brothers and sisters in Palestine, or standing in unity with certain Muslim causes. We have seen that specifically in the Arabic discussion forums of the three websites, Islam Online, Islam Way, and Amr Khalid, and reflected a strong sense of collective consciousness and uniformity. However, it was not based on what Habermas called the concept of, the Habermasian public sphere of constructive deliberation and discussion. Rather, it was based on an emotional nature. So sometimes we call that in the communication language, creating echo chambers. An echo chamber will be a place where I only hear my voice and the voices of those who are just like me. So I'm not necessarily engaging in quote unquote deliberation or discussion, or even if you want to use the Islamic concepts of ijtihad or shura, consultation or deliberation in an Islamic sense. Rather, it is just about me standing in unity with those who are like me, right? Creating a process of emotional consensus and unanimous agreement that is not necessarily based on quote unquote informed discussion, right? So it is mostly emotional rather than based on informed deliberation and discussion. Next slide, please. Participants called for a collective Islamic Ummah to stand up against what they perceive as quote unquote Western hegemony or Western imperialism, right? So that links into the notions of colonization and decolonization, which are at the heart of our discussion today in this session. Some participants said, yes, we have to stand together as one unified Muslim Ummah, and we have to be brothers and sisters, and we have to fight any form of Western hegemony or Western imperialism. Some posters called for revival of the collective Muslim identity to lay the foundations for a strong Muslim Ummah. So they saw the notion of the Muslim Ummah as a unified community in cyberspace and also in the real world that will stand in the face of Western hegemony and Western imperialism. Now that is great, but the tools in order to do so, how do you do that, right? In my opinion, as I said earlier, it is not about rejecting everything that's coming from the West or rejecting Western thought altogether or rejecting Western concepts and theoretical frameworks altogether. It's about being critical. It's about constructive, informed deliberation and discussion. These are the very important tools, whether online or offline. In other words, it's not enough to say, yes, we have to fight Western hegemony and imperialism. How are you going to do that? You have to have the mechanisms and the tools to create your own alternative reality and your own alternative patterns of thought and your own authentic ideas, whether online or offline. But in doing so, in my opinion, you also have to have the middle ground of being informed and at the same time being inclusive, rather than just excluding everything that is remotely Western, because some of it can be still helpful and useful. And of course, if you see something which is not helpful, which is not useful, you have to have the critical lens of saying, no, that does not fit my own beliefs as a Muslim, or it's not going to be something I'm going to embrace. So this critical lens is very crucial, in my opinion. Next slide, please. For example, threads from Islam Way English Forum reflected a collective sense of Islamic identity that is nurtured by a sense of Islamic sisterhood among the female participants. We talked about that a moment ago, how the sisters in the website, for example, Islam Way Sisters, were able to find a sense of community, Islamic sisterhood online, and the female participants were like supporting each other and giving each other a lot of assurance and a lot of affirmation. Yes, sister, that's great. You have to try to, assert your Muslim identity and try to be a Muslim sister in your own way and your own sense, right? Even if you are living in quote unquote a non-Muslim country. So we saw this sense of Muslim sisterhood in some of these forums, reflected a desire among these women to help each other out and to stay on the right track and the right Islamic path in a utopian virtual community, reflected a form of quote unquote Islamic feminism online. And I know that the term Islamic feminism is a loaded term and a controversial one. Not everybody agrees with the term Islamic feminism, but I personally believe that just like Islam and democracy are not mutually exclusive, also Islam and feminism are not mutually exclusive. It depends on how you understand your Muslim faith and how you understand democracy. How do you understand your Muslim faith and how do you understand feminism? So in a sense, these women, in my opinion, were Muslim feminists, and they were using the online cyberspace in order to assert their own identities as Muslim women living in the modern age, whether inside or outside Muslim majority countries. Next slide, please. However, was it all about consensus and agreement? How many minutes do we have left, Dr. Usama?
If you could wrap up kindly in a couple of minutes.
Inshallah, in a couple of minutes we'll wrap up. Thank you so much. Thank you for letting me know. So, however, was it all about consensus and agreement and uniformity? No. There were also threads where participants were in total agreement. There was consensus, which was reached through emotions rather than rational critical debate. Debates were overwhelmingly consensual due to the salience of the discussed issues, such as Al-Aqsa Mosque or supporting the brothers and sisters in Palestine. And other threads allowed collectivism and consensus around social issues in the context of an Islamic sisterhood, as we said before. These were showing the consensus or the agreement based on emotional rather than critical deliberation. Next slide, please. However, there were also spaces where there was divergence and there were differences, and it was even polemic, or in some cases even hostile. We have seen that as well, the other extreme. For example, threads from Islam Online English Forum, where people were engaging with people from different identities, different parts of the world, different geographic areas. They were highly polemic, confrontational, and sometimes even hostile and verbally aggressive. People were starting to attack others who had different views, different opinions, different ideas from their own. There was no genuine, again, shura or ijtihad in an Islamic context, no rational critical deliberation or communicative action in a Habermasian context or Habermasian sense. Resistances were expressed in the context of launching attacks on the other and the exchange of mutual labeling and blame. This is very important, just to explain that we have seen the two extremes, either the extreme of the consensual, unanimous, emotional agreement, or the extreme of the polemic, hostile, aggressive exchanges where people did not see things eye to eye, but were also not willing to meet the other halfway or midway. And neither of these, as you can imagine, of course, was necessarily quote unquote ideal or even healthy. Next slide, please. So concluding remarks. In the absence of traditional Muslim scholars or ulama, that created a big knowledge void online. I would say that this is gradually changing. Now we are seeing more and more traditional Muslim scholars, clerics, or ulama who are now becoming more present online. Yasser Qadi, Omar Sulaiman, Sister Yasmin Mujahid, and many others are starting now to appeal to young people online and to fill this kind of knowledge void online, which is a good thing. These websites reflected varying degrees of consensus, especially in the Arabic forums of Islam Way, Islam Online, and Amr Khalid, and the English forum of Islam Way Sisters. We have seen the sense of consensus. However, we have seen divergence in the English forum of Islam Online. Hardly any negotiation or middle ground was reflected. Only very, very few cases and very few threads did we actually find people engaging with others in a constructive, deliberative, informed, effective way. So you have the two extremes of either emotional consensus or emotional divergence and disagreement without meeting the other in the middle. And that is a dangerous phenomena that feeds into the process of polarization And it is still very much part of the realities in cyberspace today, unfortunately. Next slide, please. Also, the moderators of several discussion forums were either absent or they did not provide sufficient convincing justification for censoring certain posts. So it was not always the case that we found the moderators playing a very effective or helpful role in these discussion forums. Maybe that reality is still very much present in many forums today, and maybe it is also changing in a better or a more useful direction. Ijtihad in the context of these forums has opened the door for lay people with hardly any religious knowledge or qualifications to frame the agenda on issues related to Islam. That threat is still very much present, alive and well today, when you see people who do not necessarily have the religious knowledge or information and they're not equipped to provide the proper fatwa. And this showed a gap between the envisioned idealistic Habermasian public sphere and the ideal public sphere in an Islamic context of ijtihad and shura on one hand, and the actual realities and discourses online that we found in these websites on the other hand. Next slide, please. So a last word. These online Islamic discussion forums emerged as both platforms for consensus and sites of contention simultaneously. We have seen that time and time again. Islamic websites discussion forums can be used to address the three challenges facing the Muslim Ummah today, namely democratization, dialogue, and diaspora. These challenges are still alive and well, and we have to face them collectively online and offline, in the digital space as well as in the real world. And more work certainly needs to be done in this direction. So this book was just the beginning, and we hope to have more work done in this direction by myself, by my co-author, and other Muslim scholars who are studying cyberspace and the Cyber Umma today to address some of these challenges moving forward. Thank you so much. Jazakum Allahu khairan.
Barakallahu Fiki. Thank you so much. Really sort of illuminating presentation on a topic that, and I ask your co-author's indulgence for not mentioning their name as well, but an illuminating sort of presentation of a work that has covered some of the most important websites in their day. Of course, I mean, Islam Online, I think, had a far larger footprint, and then I think it went into sort of, it closed down for a short period, and now it's not as large as it was. And of course, since then, the rise of social media has also played a significant role in sort of displacing these kinds of fora, and a new kind of forum has emerged. And the question of moderating sort of these media platforms has become a concern of international proportions. There was some discussion some years ago about the genocide in Myanmar being driven by Facebook, essentially not having any sort of people who were competent in the language that was being used in Myanmar to promote genocide using its platforms. And indeed, the fact that these large tech companies, which are currently the most powerful and wealthy companies in the world, very deliberately put profit over the question of safety. And so I wanted to bring this all the way to the present, because of course, right now we are, as an ummah, have been through a genocide of the last 2 years, which is of course an ongoing genocide, arguably of nearly 100 years at this point, in Palestine. But also we witness a genocide unfolding in Sudan, which is actually a case of genocide internal to the Ummah itself. And I want to perhaps start by reflecting on, or asking you to reflect on, the role that media has played in these two venues, bringing your sort of extensive expertise on Islamic websites to bear on perhaps the lack of a role that Islamic voices have played in these two, and what it tells us about the need for algorithmic sovereignty, as it were. Sure.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair, Dr. Osama. Very important, relevant, and contemporary question for sure. I mean, they're not all the same. And we did not see the activists or the journalists or those who are using cyberspace acting in a similar way across these different tragedies and humanitarian sufferings which are unfolding in front of our own eyes day in and day out. The case of Gaza has been a case of big success, in my opinion, in terms of young journalists and young activists who are able to bring a lot of attention and a lot of awareness to the plight and the suffering of the Palestinian people, so much so that they started to change even the international public opinion and awareness about this tragedy and about the suffering of the Palestinian people. We have seen, young people protesting on U.S. campuses, in campuses in many parts around the world, on the streets of big cities in Washington, in New York, in Ontario, in Ottawa, in different parts of the world, in the Western world and elsewhere. We have seen people engaging in discussion and deliberation and dialogue around what is happening, and for the very first time, pointing fingers of blame at the Israeli occupation and talking about it very openly and very boldly and very courageously in a way that might not have been possible had it not been for this massive wave of awareness. Thanks very much to the young activists and the online digital activists, young men and women from inside and outside of Palestine who were able to bring about, day in, day out attention to this issue and to really kind of raise the awareness about it using the digital tools. So I would say that was a story of success to a very large extent. And I have written on this particular topic. I'd be happy to share the links with you, inshallah, after the session about how the digital media has been filling some of the gaps and some of the void which the mainstream media, really failed to fill and failed to address. Unfortunately, that has not been the case with other cases, like you mentioned, for example, the tragedy in Sudan, Yemen, in Myanmar, and all of these different places where Muslims are also being killed and targeted, and there is a lot of suffering. I also have an article on the invisibility of the tragedy in Sudan, unfortunately. Although these are also very compelling and very tragic realities happening in the real world and impacting Muslims in so many different ways, we did not see a similar momentum. We did not see a similar coverage. In some cases, there was even some kind of blind spot and some kind of invisibility. And that is something that we have to address and talk about. Human life is human life. Human suffering
Absolutely.
is human suffering. Muslims are Muslims. They're all our brothers and sisters, whether they are
Absolutely.
in Sudan or Yemen or Palestine or elsewhere. So I really hope that there's going to be some kind of reversal in this kind of blind spot and this kind of invisibility, and giving more attention and more coverage for these different tragedies in order to help provide the kind of needed solidarity, aid, and support and humanitarian relief and end to these tragedies in these different parts of the world.
So, I mean, as a scholar of communications, what would you, perhaps setting aside the more obvious sort of reasons that Palestine is something which, ideologically speaking, is extremely close to the hearts of many Muslims. It is a case of direct Western colonization that has, or a case of settler colonization that has been in the model of the sort of colonization that so many other Muslims have suffered, and it continues to this day. So for that reason, it gains a kind of attention. It's being perpetrated by the world's greatest superpower. Yet all of these other cases that you mentioned, Sudan, Yemen, Myanmar, in the case of Sudan and Yemen, there is a turning of a blind eye by the world's great superpowers, or in the case of Yemen, direct complicity, because in some cases it was actually supported by US sort of military refueling and the like. And so, and Myanmar, of course, by this Burmese junta. These people are perhaps the most ignored at the moment of these various groups. And so I wonder if what lessons we can learn as an ummah of digital division, and perhaps what the tools of cyberspace have to offer to break down that sort of digital divide?
These are very important questions. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Osama, for raising them. Let me just start by saying that these blind spots have been a reason for criticism. So there are those, for example, pro-Israel activists who started to raise banners and to raise, slogans and hashtags online, and even banners on the street, saying if you're talking about Palestine but you're not talking about Sudan, or you're not talking about Myanmar, you're actually a hypocrite. So they're starting to attack, those who are, turning a blind eye to these types of suffering, not because they're necessarily, quote unquote, concerned about necessarily those who are dying in Sudan or Myanmar or elsewhere, but because they're saying, hey, why are you singling out Palestine? Aren't these also your Muslim brothers and sisters who are being killed or massacred in Sudan or Yemen or Myanmar or elsewhere? So I mean, when you are
كلمة حق أريد بها باطل.
yes, but we have to also be aware of that. We have to also be aware of these types of criticisms. When we hear them, we don't turn a blind eye to them. We don't sweep them under the rug, right? Even if they're coming from your own opponents or your own critics or those on the other side of the fence, right? We have to take them very seriously as well and say, hey, wait a minute. Why are we, privileging or giving one side or one story or one particular type of suffering more attention than another? Like I said, all human life is sacred, right? And these are all our Muslim brothers and sisters. So obviously, the notion of the digital divide played a very important role. The fact that in many cases, those in Sudan, in Yemen, do not even have the basic resources in order to be able to tell their stories in their own voice, or do not have even the tools in order to spread the message. But that's where our role comes in as a Muslim Ummah, to try to provide aid and support, not just in the form of, maybe just giving food and giving, humanitarian relief, which is obviously very important, but also trying to offer the tools to try to do so, to try to offer the tools of, maybe digital tools, maybe the help in terms of logistics, the help in terms of coverage, the help in terms of journalistic training, so that these voices are not left out and are not left behind. So I think that we have to also look at ourselves in the mirror. Yes, the other side can be critical of you for their own agenda or their own self-interest. That's understandable. But I also have to look at myself in the mirror and ask myself the question, have I been fair, equitable, even-handed, or have I been privileging one issue over others? And if that is the case, then I have to address these types of inequalities, and I have to talk about these issues in a strong, loud voice as well, because that is my duty and my responsibility as a Muslim, as a journalist, as an activist, as an academic, as an educator.
Barakallah fiki. I mean, in that connection, actually, one of our sort of viewers is asking a question: Is it Muslims who are not exposing Sudan's tragedy online, or is it rather the platform stopping such efforts? As someone who tried to post on TikTok about Sudan and Palestine 2 years ago, Sudan posts faced harsher suppression, nasty reasons for removal to deter and demoralize. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on this. I mean, this is these kinds of algorithmic biases. I tried to join TikTok in the course of the genocide, and every time I tried, I didn't really understand. I was wondering if I was making a mistake, and then someone else who was a user was saying, actually, no, there's a systematic suppression. Every time I tried to subscribe to one of these Palestine-only sort of, everything I was subscribing to was going to be Palestine-oriented, and it would automatically unsubscribe me. So it seems that these systems had just, a few months into the genocide already been internalizing these kinds of norms that were being broadcast by the, colonial powers. So, yeah.
Yeah, the algorithmic suppression is a reality, right? And I think I mentioned that during the presentation as well, when I mentioned that I know people personally whose, Facebook accounts have been deleted. They've been given a warning by Facebook because they've been posting some pro-Palestine content. And then after the first warning, After that, their account was suspended or the account was deleted altogether. These are real threats and real issues that have been also happening in cyberspace, and we have to face them and we have to talk about them. Twitter, like I mentioned, some people became so dismayed with Twitter, which is now called X, because they've also seen some of these algorithmic biases. And they've seen that every time they post something, for example, or tweet something about Palestine, they get less and less viewership and less exposure on Twitter. So much so that they're starting to reach very, very few people. And they felt that the whole idea of tweeting became pointless. So some of them even migrated. They left Twitter or X altogether and they started to go to another platform such as Blue Sky, which is now attracting more academics and more intellectuals who are migrating and leaving Twitter or X behind for these reasons. But I think that in the case of Palestine versus Sudan, I really think that Palestine has gotten the lion's share when it comes to algorithmic suppression because of the sheer volume of people who are starting to tweet and to post and to share content related to Palestine. So we have seen more of these algorithmic biases and trends really playing out more in the case of Palestine compared to other cases. In the case of Sudan and Yemen and Myanmar and others, it's been the fact that there has not been enough, as I said before, enough visibility or enough attention, right? And that is a very sad reality that we as Muslims have to address and to face as well. Why aren't we paying attention equally to these tragedies which are claiming many, many, many lives? There are more than 2 million people who have been displaced and lost their homes in Sudan. They're becoming refugees. Many women who are being raped, many young people who are dying. It is truly very sad. So we have to speak up against all forms of injustice, regardless of how they play out and where they play out, and whether there is a form of Western colonization, like you said, or whether it is an internal crisis and internal tragedy within the Muslim Ummah. In all of these cases, we have to bring attention to the plight of our Muslim brothers and sisters. That is our moral and ethical responsibility. And we have to learn how to use the digital media tools and social media tools to do so in the most effective way.
Barakallah Fiki. I apologize. There seems to be some kind of work going on outside my office, so it's a very strange time to do this sort of work. So apologies if the sound becomes a bit loud. I will mute my voice, but hopefully you can still hear me, and I will try and adjust things if perhaps this will help somewhat, inshallah. So Barakallah Fiki. I mean, I think that's extremely important. One of the things, I mean, it very much stands to reason that the suppression would be taking place on the Palestinians far more than it would be on the Sudanese sort of case of genocide, because the perpetrators of the Palestinian genocide have far more clout in being able to suppress these things. And as you say, the reason for the lack of reporting on Sudan is because of the Muslim Ummah's own taqsir, its own failings. And this is something which actually we need to take a lot more seriously, as you very strongly highlighted. But and this is a tragic failure, because in the last week or so, I think well over 2,000 people have been killed in Sudan, far more than was killed in Palestine. And we are quite neglectful of this as an ummah. And we, it makes one think of the slogans of the, after the killing of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter. It seems to apply in the Muslim world just as much as it would in the sort of in North America. But barakallahu fiki for that. Once again, I apologize for the background sound. I hope it's still reasonably clear to be able to hear me.
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, inshallah.
So I wonder if you could perhaps share some examples. So I mean, these are just some questions that I had, and please feel free to sort of make of them what you will. But are there examples of Muslims who have successfully created a shared digital identity across divides? We are thinking in terms of an Ummatic sort of branching out, and the virtual world is now becoming one of those spaces in which we can explore this. are there any spaces where Muslims have successfully created this bridging, and how can we translate online solidarity into a coordinated real-world Ummatic initiative, in your view?
These are excellent questions. Let me start with the second one first, right? I want to highlight the fact that whatever happens online can never be divorced from the realities offline, right? Both of them are very closely interlinked to each other. So, unfortunately, when we talk about things like lack of middle ground or lack of constructive dialogue, is that something which is just purely reserved or limited to the online space? Or is it really a reflection of the lack of informed dialogue and deliberation and discussion between Muslims and other Muslims, right? And Muslims and non Muslims in the real world? In other words, a lot of what we are seeing and witnessing online is a reflection of reality. And a lot of what is happening in reality is reflected online. These are both two sides of the same coin. So when you see a Muslim ummah, which is in so many ways, unfortunately, and that is a reality that we have to face and talk about, no matter how painful it is. When you see the degree of polarization and fragmentation and division, which is prevailing among the Muslim ummah, so much so that people cannot agree on a lot of issues. They cannot stand in solidarity with each other on a lot of notions. That is also something which is reflected online. The online space, think about it as a mirror that reflects what is happening in the real world, right? So in order for you to come up with a more unified space online, you have to first think about how can you bridge some of the gaps and the fragmentations and the divides which are truly pulling aside the Muslim ummah today. And these are very deep and very true. We have a lot of political fragmentation. We have a lot of socioeconomic divisions. We have a lot of inequities and invisibilities, like we're talking about the cases of Yemen and Sudan, for example, and others, right? So we have to look at ourselves in the mirror. And once you start to bridge some of these gaps and some of these divides in the real world, then inshallah, that is going to also be reflected in the sense of having better and more informed and more unifying dialogue in cyberspace. So I think that both of them are interlinked and intertwined in many ways. And whatever happens in cyberspace is reflective of the deep divisions and fragmentations that we are seeing in the real world. So the reality has to change, right? إن الله لا يغير ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم. Allah is not going to change the reality of people until they work hard to change their own reality. And we have to work hard to change our own reality in the real world. And then, inshallah, that will start to show in more unified, positions and more unified forums online. What I'm seeing now is more of like quote unquote individual efforts here and there rather than orchestrated efforts by certain groups or organizations. So I see, for example, Sister Yasmin Mujahid, I see Brother Omar Sulaiman, Brother Yasir Qadi, and others. These are, pretty much young Muslim scholars who have won the trust and the credibility of many Muslims worldwide. They listen to them, they tune into their messages. The messages are overwhelmingly positive, and they try to really kind of bridge some of these differences and divides. What I'm hoping to see more in the future is not just individual efforts here and there, but maybe more orchestrated, coordinated efforts. Maybe platforms like Ummatics and others can try to bring together some of these issues and try to bridge some of these gaps and some of these divides moving forward. We certainly need more of that.
Inshallah, I hope, where there are possibilities for initiatives of this kind, I think, Muslims have an obligation to try and engage them or bring them to the public. And inshallah, may Allah grant us tawfiq to do what is pleasing to Him. But it's one of the things that, unfortunately, when you were speaking about how divided we are as an ummah, one of the thoughts that came to me was a verse in the Quran which came to describe the unbelievers. تَحْسَبُهُمْ جَمِيعًا وَقُلُوبُهُمْ شَتَّى. And our qulub, inshallah, are not shatta. Our qulub are not, our hearts are not divided and dispersed. But sometimes what we see is our political leaders, their hearts might be dispersed in ways that maybe the whole Ummah agrees that we need to do something about Palestine, or we need to do something about Sudan, or Yemen, or Myanmar, or what's happening to the Indians in sort of Muslims in India, or what's happening to the Muslims of Kashmir. And those sorts of things are a concern for large numbers of Muslims, but our leaders are not really attentive to that, because we have been divided up into so many different nations that are vying for the attention of the superpowers. It's a difficult situation. I wanted to maybe come back to that in a moment, and first ask you a question which has come in the chat, which is a question we've alluded to already, but this puts it very concisely. How can Muslims go towards a digital ummah when we rely on so many systems that are not owned by us?
Excellent question. Excellent question. And that was one thing that was raised in a conference I was attending recently, this exact same point. And we were talking about it in the age of AI and artificial intelligence, where these machine-based systems of knowledge are not neutral. If you think that ChatGPT is giving you neutral answers, that is not true. They are already fed by certain biases, by certain prejudices, by certain patterns of knowledge, by certain information that has been collectively fed into these systems of artificial intelligence or these algorithmic structures, right? Who feeds them with these types of knowledge, right? The creators of these platforms. So if you write the word, for example, terrorism or terrorist, and you say, I want an image of a terrorist, the chances are AI is going to give you the image of somebody who looks like, a guy wearing a turban and, brown skin, dark skin, who looks like, quote unquote, an Arab or a Muslim, right? Where is he getting this image from? Already these systems of knowledge are existing online, and they create these types of biases, and they create these types of prejudices, right? If you think about give ChatGPT the question, give me an example of an act of terrorism. 9 out of 10, I think it's going to say 9/11. Where is it getting 9/11 from? When in reality, 95% of acts of terrorism committed on US soil, according to Pew surveys and other types of surveys, are committed by non-Muslims. They're mostly committed by right-wing, white supremacist, extremist groups. They commit the majority of so-called, quote-unquote, acts of terror. But is that what is fed into these machine learning algorithms and systems of knowledge online? The answer is no. Right? So you're already seeing the inherent biases. And therefore, one of the recommendations of this conference that I attended recently was exactly the question that the brother or sister just asked now, which is how can we as Muslims, instead of just being upset and angry and and very dissatisfied with all of that, how can we play a role in terms of filling some of these voids, filling some of these gaps? And the reality is that will not happen unless you start to create your own indigenous, authentic, self-created tools of knowledge, right? You create your own AI, you create your own systems of knowledge online and offline. You try to liberate yourself from the intellectual and technological hegemony. And that needs a lot of work. And I want to go back again to your point, Dr. Osama, about the governments. Yes, of course, the governments are a big part of the problem. There is no question about it. But we also have to think about our own responsibility as individuals, as educators, as journalists, as writers, as academics, right, as activists. What can you do within your own capacity? What can I do within my own capacity, right? We are not part of governments. We are not part of these structures, right? Alhamdulillah. But we have a responsibility. I have a responsibility. You have a responsibility. So if every one of us tries to light a candle, right, to take a step in the right direction, I think that this is what Allah is going to ask us about at the end of the day. So I see, for example, initiatives like Ummatics and opening platforms for these types of discussions as a right step in the right direction. Jazakumullah khair for that, right? If I can produce more useful knowledge in my own capacity as a writer or a researcher to alert people to the importance of these issues, I'm also playing a part. If you are an engineer and you can design some of these alternative systems of knowledge online and bring about new technological tools and devices, you are also being part of the solution. So, yes, of course, politics and government is a big part of the problem. We cannot deny that. But we also have to think about what each and every one of us within the umbrella of the Muslim Ummah can do in order to address some of these challenges and hopefully create a better reality moving forward, inshallah.
Absolutely. And I should sort of emphasize that, it's reported as a hadith. I actually discussed this in my book, and I cannot recall at this point in time. I think it's a hadith which is hasan or da'if, but its meaning is considered sound. كما تكونوا يولى عليكم. That as you will be, thus you will have your leaders. So if you yourselves are going to be tolerant of this sort of injustice, then your leaders will be like that. And so in no way am I trying to absolve ourselves as individuals who are not rulers, because the rulers also will operate within an environment which is, which depends on the pressures that come from below as well. To what extent are the masses going to tolerate a genocide happening, of Muslims in other parts of the world, and create a sense that actually I as a ruler need to do something about this? It's not something which I should just say is some other country's problem. It's my problem as a Muslim. And I think we need to do what we can to, I think I'm very fortunate in some respects to be in one of the few countries which has actually voiced so much outrage at the ongoing genocide in Gaza through its. I'm based in Qatar, and Al Jazeera has been one of these platforms to do this. But this has unfortunately not been the case for a lot of countries, and this has been a real sort of tragedy, I think, on the part of a lot of the Ummah. But and I in no way take any credit for Al Jazeera's stance. This is something which is completely independent of me. But I hope that we as individuals recognize that we all have an individual stake and obligation in this regard, as you so importantly highlighted. Perhaps if I can also sort of switch gears slightly and looking back at the Arab Spring for a moment, social media in some respects was responsible for the toppling of regimes at one point. Is there any role for these technologies to build civilization? And what would it take for digital activism to evolve into a shared Ummatic project in your view?
These are two excellent but two very big questions. Let me start with the first one, as someone who has written a lot about cyber activism in the Arab Spring, before the Arab Spring, during the Arab Spring, and after the Arab Spring. And let me first just highlight the point that I always get asked the question: had it not been for the role of social media and digital media, do you think the Arab Spring would have happened? And the answer is yes, it would have happened, but maybe not with the same momentum, not with the same power, not with the same outreach, right? So I always like to think of these digital tools as supplementary, complementary, right? They cannot bring about change all by themselves. So there was this tendency to have a technological euphoria or technological determinism at the beginning of the Arab Spring, and to say things like the Facebook revolution in Egypt, the Twitter uprising in Tunisia, the YouTube uprising in Syria. And I say, wait a minute, let's wait a minute. These tools are catalysts. They can speed up the process of political transition or democratic reform. They can be amplifiers. They can raise the voices of dissent and make it louder, right? They can help to spread the message to much larger numbers of people in a very short time. But can they replace the human element? Can they replace the human activism on the ground? The answer is no. If people do not have the will and the desire to go out in the street in massive numbers and to face bullets and face the possibility of being arrested, harassed, detained, or even killed, nothing is going to change. So we have to really pay attention to this notion of technological determinism, we should not overcredit social media or digital media tools. At the end of the day, they're just tools. It all depends on the players on the ground. How can we try to use these tools in the most effective, in the most constructive way? And as I said in my presentation, at the very beginning, people were like, yeah, just give people the internet and they're going to have freedom. Give people the internet, they're going to have democracy. That's a very simplistic notion, right? 14 years later, we are seeing things, unfortunately, reversing in many of these so-called post-Arab Spring countries. Even Tunisia, the only country we used to hail and celebrate as quote-unquote the exceptionalism or the exception to the authoritarianism in the Arab world, even this country had its own reversals in terms of democracy and the path to democracy and reform. So we have to ask ourselves again serious questions, right? The reality on the ground needs to change. How can we build an active, informed civil society? How can we build civil society institutions? How can we become truly tolerant of those who are different from us? How can we have positive and constructive oppositional forces without the threat of people going to jail or being arrested just because they're speaking truth to power? Unless you have these changes in place, social media alone is not going to become the magical tool or the magic stick that's going to turn things around. And that is one of the biggest lessons that I think we should learn from the experiment or the experiences of the Arab Spring.
Barakallah fiki. I mean, in some respects, what you're asking is, how can we develop that tolerance? How can we create those civil societies? How can we engage in these sorts of activities without the risk of going to jail? These are actually questions we're posing to the authoritarians, unfortunately. And unfortunately, I don't think they're in any rush to relinquish power, because they are the ones, as soon as you establish a civil society organization, they will come to try and shut it down. Or, it might be done in the guise of rule of law. They will not issue the permit that legitimates it. As soon as you engage in a protest, again, under the guise of rule of law, or I think Nathan Brown calls it rule by law, they will say, oh, this goes against such and such a law in the civil code, and therefore we're having to shut it down because you've not requested a permit for this protest. And of course, those permits are never issued. So I wonder, I mean,
if you allow me to jump in, Dr. Osama, just
please.
To say that what you just described now is a very big dilemma. It is the dilemma of the chicken and egg question, right? In order to have democracy, you need to have an active civil society. But in order to have an active civil society, you also need to have a degree of democracy, right? So that has been also a chicken and egg question that a lot of people have been rotating in this, closed, vicious cycle or circle, and moving exactly along these lines that you just kindly described now, that in order for me to have some kind of effective and constructive oppositional movement, I need to have a degree of assurance that if I go out in the street and protest, I will not be arrested. And that needs an active civil society. But the active civil society needs a degree of democracy. And democracy will not happen unless you have an active civil society. So in a sense, it has been really a chicken and egg question. It has been a dilemma, which is still pretty much going on. And a lot of people are asking this very, very same question. But I want to go back again to what we can control versus what we cannot control. Because obviously we cannot control some of these hegemonic power structures and these authoritarian regimes, but maybe we can raise awareness, education, right? Kalima at-tayyiba, the good word, right? The amr bil ma'ruf, you call for what is righteous and what is correct. So again, so in order for us not to despair, right? God forbid we don't want to despair. We have to go back again to what we can do and what we can control, even if it is small, But inshallah, this is what we can do, and this is what Allah is gonna ask us about at the end of the day.
Right. Barakallah fiki. I think that's a very important add-on. I mean, we live in an unusual time. This is sort of referred to in the hadith as mulkun jabriya, so to speak, an absolutely authoritarian sort of political rule in so much of the Muslim world. And then, of course, I mean, Many of us live in parts of the Muslim world or outside of the Muslim world where we have remarkable freedoms, where we can talk about these things and we can be critical. You know, in so much of the Muslim world or so much of the Arab world, talking about the Arab Spring is, you know, a risk, so to speak. I mean, it's. I want to. I mean, of course, you've done so much work on the Arab Spring. I wrote my monograph on the Arab Spring as well, and I like to think of this as a dry run for what will come in the future, inshallah. It was a learning opportunity for the Ummah, for future sort of attempts at reform, at political re-energizing, at democratization, as you have so eloquently put it. Perhaps I can ask you, and please feel free to jump in if you want to add in anything, but perhaps I can ask you an additional question, which is kind of reframing what some of the questions that we've been asking in the past. So what are the obstacles against Muslims establishing an alternative to platforms like Facebook, like TikTok, or indeed like OpenAI's ChatGPT? What are the practical challenges, and would overcoming those, surmounting those, lead to a realization of ummatic unity, or a greater chance of realizing that?
Yeah, I think that, you know, there are definitely a lot of challenges. There's no question about it, right? A lot of these systems of knowledge, as we know them today, are Western based and Western manufactured and Western developed, right? And as I said, we don't have to necessarily frown upon or exclude or refuse to collaborate, for example, with Western scholars or, you know, Western systems of knowledge. Some of these can be very helpful. Some of these can be very positive. Some of them can be constructive. We just need to be able to filter some of these, right? To be able to be selective. Which ones can I possibly take and which ones do I need to leave out? So I'm not of the pattern of thought that we have to, for example, just boycott everything Western altogether or stay away from anything Western. I'm not of this school of thought, but I'm also not for buying into and blindly adopting and, you know, just basically fitting into everything that is quote unquote produced by the West either. You have to have this middle ground, just like you need to have the middle ground between emotional consensus and polemic, you know, divergence. You need to also have the middle ground between buying into and embracing, you know, Western produced systems of knowledge and technology, or boycotting and refusing to collaborate with Western scholars or Western systems of knowledge. As we said about artificial intelligence, that some of these are already fed with these biases and these algorithmic, you know, forms of knowledge, which are not always quote unquote pro-Arab or pro-Muslim. We need to think about having Muslim engineers and Muslim software engineers and electric engineers and scholars of media and communication and education. All of these need to think together. We need to have Muslim think tanks. We need to have Muslim scholars coming together into some form of agreement, into some form of collaboration to think about, okay, how can we make these new technologies work for us? We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, you know, if there are already steps that have been taken to build artificial intelligence, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So, no, we're not going to accept these because they have been created by a Canadian or an American engineer. Of course not. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, but you need to think about how can I try to change maybe some of the inputs, some of the biases, some of the discrimination, some of the algorithms which are discriminating against me. And that needs a collective orchestrated effort that brings about people from different walks of life, those who are experts in technology, in engineering, in digital media, in communication, in education, to come together, to brainstorm, to think, to deliberate, and to create these think tanks and these technological institutions and these power structures that would benefit from the existing knowledge and build on it to create something which is more autonomous to the Muslim Ummah and more autonomous to Muslims and Arabs in particular.
Barakallah fiki. I think this is a major challenge at this stage of the sort of development cycle of AI, for example. And I have colleagues, my colleagues Mu'taz al-Khatib and Muhammad Ghali, both professors and jurists, both fuqaha and ulama, as well as professors as sort of like who are trained in Western universities as well. But they are working on a large language model that is looking at Islamic questions. And I think it's possible for us to do these things on a small scale. The challenge that we face as an ummah is, as long as we're divided into 50-something states, we do not have the centralized, unified strength, political, economic, strategic, of a United States or a China that seem to be the leading forces in this arena. And their equivalents of sort of Silicon Valley or Shenzhen in the Chinese context, and the potential of pouring in potentially like $1 trillion worth of planned funding and attracting global talent. I mean, as you said, we don't need to sort of like think that this is the project of a specific nationality or something like this. And this is what they show in these parts of the world, that they attract people from all over the world. I think at the moment, the challenge would be, how do you replicate that level of centralized coordination? It seems quite distant now. There are efforts in the Gulf, in the Khalij specifically, to invest in these types of technologies, but they will be minuscule compared to what's possible in Silicon Valley or in Shenzhen in China.
But
I
you know
wonder
what?
if you have any.
Yeah, Dr.
Yeah,
Osama, you know what? We have all the sources of power within the Muslim Ummah, right?
of
You
course,
look at
of
countries
course.
in the Gulf, they have the economic power, they
Right,
have the capital, they have the
right,
money,
right.
right?
Yeah,
And then you look at countries like Egypt and many of the North African countries, they have the
yeah.
human labor,
Capital,
right?
yes. Capital, yes.
They have the human labor. They have many young people who are looking for jobs and
Right,
looking for good employment. You look at
right,
countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, and
right.
these countries are now emerging, right? And
Yeah,
they have their own technological abilities,
yeah,
and they have young engineers who
yeah.
have the technological knowledge. What you need to
Absolutely,
do is how to orchestrate, how to
absolutely,
coordinate
absolutely.
sources of power. And that is
Yes.
exactly what our enemies have been working against.
Right,
They've been
right,
trying to feed
right,
into the division, into the hostility, so that we
right.
are always engaged in animosity. We're always engaged in hostility. We're always engaged in division. We're always
Yeah,
engaged in polarization, so that there
yeah,
is no room for this kind of coordination or this kind of solidarity. But we do have, I argue that we do have all the tools of power. You have the money in the Gulf,
yeah,
you have the human labor in North Africa, you have the emerging technology in countries like Malaysia and others. All you need to do is to bring these together and to connect the dots. You don't play into the powers of division, polarization that tries to take you apart or tear you apart. You try to come
absolutely.
together and to coordinate your efforts. And if you do that, your power can far exceed the examples you just gave of Silicon Valley
Absolutely.
in the US or its alternative in China. And the enemies of the Muslim Ummah, they know that very well. They know that there is a lot of power within these 2 billion Muslims worldwide, and
Absolutely.
therefore their main job and their main effort has been targeted at how can we divide them? How can we tear them apart? How can we keep them always divided and always fragmented? If they come to, they will be unbeatable power. It's going to become an unbeatable power like no other, and they know that very well.
So this is I think an excellent point on which to perhaps focus as we bring this colloquium to its conclusion. I think this is a very positive way of reading our situation as an ummah. We can look, and we have considered a lot of the difficulties that we're facing as an ummah, and there is a lot of tragedy to be seen. But of course, عجبا لأمر المؤمن فإن أمره كله خير. The state of the believer is always wonderful because all of the states, whether it's positive or negative, is positive for the believer, inshallah. But I want to perhaps lean into this a little more, what you've just said, that the Ummah globally, 2 billion plus at this point in time. Economically, it will be a significant economic sort of power if the financial resources, I mean, the sovereign wealth funds of the Gulf states are in the top 5 or top 6 of the world sovereign wealth funds. These are incredibly wealthy states. And in addition to that, the human capital, as we've mentioned, 2 billion Muslims. The geographical spread means that there's a huge amount of land available for Muslims. But it's about linking up these resources. There's also a huge amount of talent in places like Malaysia, where they have, the East Asians have a lot of technological development. Historically, places like Turkey actually have a very well-developed university sector. And of course, the Gulf has been developing the knowledge economy very, very assiduously for some years. So I wonder if you can maybe envision, if it's not too much to ask, envision an ummatic future that brings together all of these different forces. What might that look like? Perhaps even thinking about a timescale.
I think that is a very big question. It's $1 million question, Dr. Osama. Definitely, we don't have the time or even all the knowledge we need in order to answer this very, very big question. But I would just start by saying, let's focus on what brings us together rather than what divides us. This is a very, very important point. And I want to give you an example that has been bothering me for the last few days. The success and the rise of Zahran Mumdani, right, who became the first Muslim mayor of New York City, one of the biggest cities in the United States and around the world, in a form of what comes close to a miracle, right? A lot of people were like, wow, this is amazing. You know what some of the Muslims are talking about that in their own circles and WhatsApp groups and online? Oh, but he is not a Sunni Muslim. He is a Shiite Muslim. His brand of Islam and his sect of
Right,
Islam is very
right,
different from the mainstream. Wow, how can he call himself a Muslim when his wife is so dressed in a very liberal manner? She is not wearing the hijab. Look at how she is dressed. Oh, wait a minute. He is supporting gay rights? How can he be a Muslim and support the gay rights? The answer is simple. This guy is not coming as a Muslim da'iyah. He is not coming as a Muslim cleric. He is not claiming to be Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab, one of al-Khulafa al-Rashidin, right? The righteous, Khalifas of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wassalam. The guy is a political candidate who was able to run an effective, successful campaign that was able to speak to young people and the working class and those who are suffering from the high cost of living in a very expensive city like New York. And he was able to show a sign of hope for the future for these people. He did not claim to be some kind of Islamic cleric or some kind of preacher or to be the model Muslim in any way, shape, or form. Yet, instead of focusing on the significance of this political moment and what it means for Muslims, that this guy is saying no more to Islamophobia. No candidate is going to win on an Islamophobic agenda in a city like New York, where 9/11 has been used time and time again as an Islamophobic boogeyman, as a way to scare people from Islam and Muslims. That is a huge historic moment. How his wife is dressed is his business and her business. He supports gay rights. Well, guess what? He's a political candidate. He is not a prophet. He is a Shia Muslim. He is not a Sunni Muslim. Well, guess what? We are all Muslims. We all say La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. We say the Shahada that makes us all Muslims, right? So instead of focusing on what brings us together, we focus on what divides us and what polarizes us. That became a very sad moment for me because honestly, over the last few days, I really became troubled by seeing these messages coming from many, many different people, some of whom I know very well, some of whom I've known for years, some of whom are highly educated. But that is representative of what is wrong with our Muslim Ummah today, Dr. Osama, unfortunately. The fact that we are always focusing on what brings us apart. How is Sahar different from me, rather than what do I have in common with Sahar, and therefore we can have a constructive discussion and dialogue together. If we keep thinking like that all the time about what divides us, what is different, the different sects, the different ways of practicing Islam, rather than thinking about the similarities and what can bring us together, unfortunately, I don't see much hope for the dream of some kind of unification and solidarity among the Muslim Ummah. So before we think about the big projects that we were talking about a moment ago, like bringing the capital from the Gulf and the human labor from North Africa and the technological and engineering excellence of people in Malaysia and elsewhere, before we think about this big project, let's think first about how we can change our own mindset as Muslims. How can we think about what brings us together, our own similarity and uniformity, rather than focusing on what drives us apart and what sets us apart and what divides us. It is really, really a problem of mindset before anything else.
And Barakallah Fiki, I think this is really an excellent point. And actually, to be honest, we can't get through this Ummatics without mentioning the victory of Zahran Mamdani, because it is such an important sort of event in the history of US politics, and arguably in the history of world politics, because, for a Muslim, regardless of what people say, at least according to Ahl Sunnah, he considers himself a 12 Shia, and the 12 Shia are considered to be Muslim according to the vast majority of Ahl Sunnah, even if they're not considered to be sort of like exemplary, so to speak, in their theology. But for a Muslim to become the the mayor of the richest city in the world, in the heart of neoliberal capitalism, is not a small feat. In the heart of the Jewish diaspora, in the country with the largest number of Jews globally outside of Israel, for a Muslim who is a out-and-out anti-Zionist, whose father is Mahmoud Mamdani, who famously wrote Good Muslim, Bad Muslim in response to 9/11. That is something which is truly extraordinary for, for, I think, the Ummah in many ways. I just want to highlight, if I may, the points that you made is something which is very important from an Ummatics perspective as well. Ummatics has reflected and continues to reflect in our founding president, I think I might get the titles wrong, but Professor Ubayma Anjum, who is one of the the chief spearheaders of the research at Ummatics, considers the question of politics to be very importantly grounded in the question of how do we manage these differences between different theological outlooks, between different religious outlooks. And at the end of the day, we need to overcome and learn to prioritize different types of differences between the members of the Ummah, so that we don't end up fighting each other over things which should be secondary to being able to live together. And so, yes, someone might be even of a sect which would be traditionally considered outside the bounds of Islam, such as the Ahmadi sect. But we need to figure out how do we, as a Muslim Ummah, manage these differences with different groups and live a political existence without mutual persecution. And so, unfortunately, because we haven't figured that out, that's why I think in our discourse, including in our private discourse, we end up having these sorts of discussions saying, oh, but is he the right kind of Muslim? And in the context of New York politics, that's a completely irrelevant question. He's the kind of candidate who is out there defending the right of Muslims to be in the public sphere. That's what matters in that context. And he defends the right of Palestinians to equal dignity as Israelis. That's what really matters in that context. And saying those things is a revolutionary statement in that context.
100%, absolutely, absolutely, Dr. Osama. I cannot agree more. The fact that he stands up and says, I'm a Muslim and I'm unapologetic about it, that's big. That is
Right.
huge, right?
Right.
And like you said, for all the reasons you mentioned, when he talks, very openly about the suffering of the Palestinian people, when he talks very openly
Right.
criticizing the occupation of Palestine, these are things which are, unthinkable in a
Right.
city like New York a
Absolutely.
few years ago.
Absolutely.
Unthinkable. If you said
Absolutely.
that, nobody's going to believe you that a candidate who says some of these things could ever be elected and get a majority and become the 34-year-old, very young man becoming the mayor of New York with this kind of identity. This is what matters to us. This is
Right.
supposed to be what matters to us. His sect or his faith
Yes.
is between him and Allah. What his wife wears is between him and his wife, and between his wife and Allah. That is not our business. Our business is that this guy has very bold and very clear politics, and these politics resonated with the young people. And by the way, there are some young Jews who have been very active in his campaign. They supported him, they
Yeah.
stood with him,
Yeah.
and that is,
Absolutely.
indicative of the kind of public awareness change that we've been talking about earlier. If you remember the public opinion change we're talking about around Palestine and
Right.
around the issue of Palestine, there have been a lot of young Jewish people who
Right.
have been very active and very instrumental in the success of Zahran Momdani's
Right.
campaign,
Right.
right? And they've been active in it offline and online.
Right.
So, I mean, that tells you some kind of change in the right direction. So, what we as
Absolutely.
Muslims should celebrate this moment for all of these reasons, than just focusing on what divides us again by thinking of him as like, oh, his sect of Islam, or why does his wife dress in this way? And unfortunately, I have seen that before also with other Muslim candidates. Ilhan Omar, who is a member of the Congress. Of course, she's a congresswoman. There were
Right.
the first two Muslim congresswomen, Rashida
Right.
Tlaib, who is a
Right.
Palestinian American, and Ilhan
Right.
Omar, a Somali American, right? And
Right.
Ilhan Omar shows up at an event, supporting gay rights, and then, all hell break loose. Oh my God, how can she do that? She is a political woman. She's a congresswoman. She is not seeing herself as Da'iya Islamiyya. She is not presenting herself as a Muslim preacher or a Muslim cleric. That would be a different story if she presented herself in this light. At the end of the day, she is a politician. At the end of the day, she's a congresswoman, right? And she has to be embracive and inclusive of all the different sects of society. Otherwise, she will not win. So we have to really have a revolution in education. We have to have a revolution in discussion, in dialogue. How can we come together across our differences? How can we see the similarities, not the differences? How can we see people for who they are and celebrate their success rather than focusing on what tears us apart? This is a revolution in thinking, in intellectual thought, and in education. And if we're not able to win this revolution, we will not be able to win other battles, such as the battle in technology or engineering or AI. You have to first address this key battle first in order to be able to achieve success in other battlegrounds.
So, I mean, I would just add in that sort of context. So, obviously, I wear the hat of an academic and a faqih and a scholar of aqidah as well. And I would just say that every discipline has its context, and what people should recognize when they see these public political figures is you're not taking your deen from them. You're not
Exactly.
taking your aqidah from them. You're not
Exactly.
taking your fiqh from them.
Right.
And so if you understand that and you recognize actually they're doing certain things, which being in the public sphere in a Western democratic context, maybe they have to make certain judgment calls about what they must do in order to achieve what they consider to be the greater good. And that's something where reasonable people can disagree. But to make this a question of takfir and these sorts of things becomes very, very sort of problematic. And that's, as you say, one of the reasons we don't have a certain kind of political maturity. But at the same time, I think we should recognize that some of these issues can be very serious. If you're a believing Muslim, you should not take them lightly in your personal life. And the public domain in a non-Muslim country, I think, is different from the public domain in a Muslim country in many respects. So I think it would be highly problematic for Muslims to, in a Muslim country, for a Muslim in the public domain of a Muslim country to advocate for gay rights. I do not think that's acceptable. And this is something which, unfortunately, when I was living in the West, one of the things, I had these discussions in the UK, where in some respects the sort of like advocacy or the gay lobby was ahead of the US in some respects. And there was a certain amount of intolerance, unfortunately, on the part of the gay lobby, basically saying, if you're going to be a Muslim who wants to come into the public sphere in any way, shape or form, we're going to namtahinukum. We're going to test you or put you through an inquisition. Do you embrace gay rights? You on a personal level, you as a Muslim cleric. And I cannot say yes to that. I can say, you guys, you have every right to do what you like with your laws in your country. But I, on a personal level, and when I teach in my, when I give my sermons, I have to say this is a sin before God. And nothing can change that for any Muslim. So I think these sorts of nuances need to be learned in a democratic society also by the people who are these non-Muslim advocates of gay rights, who may have had their own struggles and had their own reasons for being so forceful about these things. But yes, there are nuances to this.
I mean, I totally agree with you as a Muslim woman myself, totally agree with you. I'm just trying to say that when you focus only on what divides us,
Absolutely.
rather than what brings us together, it is problematic because, as you said, and you rightly said that these are not people that we take our deen from, right? You're not taking your religion from Mamdani or from Ilhan Omar. Just see them for who they are. They are politicians, and a politician at the end of the day wants to win. That's what they are. They're running in order to win a campaign, in order to reach office, right? Now, if I was to run for a campaign, will I make the same choices? Maybe not. Maybe you will not make the same choices. Maybe I will not make the same choices. But let's see them for who they are. They are politicians who are able to succeed to reach office. Is their success something good or bad for the Muslim Ummah? It is good in the sense that they are upholding their Muslim identity. They're saying, we are Muslims, we reject Islamophobia, we don't accept that Muslims are discriminated against in education, in the workplace, in everyday life, in the public sphere. So in that sense, their political gain or their success is a plus for the Muslim Ummah, regardless of their own everyday practices. They're praying the 5 times a day, or they fast in Ramadan, or what kind of sect of Islam they are embracing, or his wife is wearing the hijab or not, because they're not our quote unquote model of Muslim clerics, for example, and they never claimed to play this role. So we have to see them for who they are and just take the advantage or the benefit that this moment of success brings to us as a Muslim community. And you can leave out whatever you think is in disagreement with your own aqidah or your own faith. But in order to do so, you need a certain level of nuance. You need a certain level of education, which unfortunately, and I'm very disappointed to say that, a lot of people that I personally know in my personal circles who are highly educated people, they still cannot move beyond this kind of mindset. And therefore, they're starting to say things like, this guy is very controversial. I don't know if we should even support him. What are you guys celebrating? What is there to celebrate? And I'm like, no, this is a big historic moment that deserves to be celebrated for all the reasons we just mentioned now. So this kind of mindset, Dr. Usama, if you cannot get beyond this kind of divisive mentality, then forget about building the kind of unity and the kind of solidarity, the kind of coordination that we have been talking about a few minutes ago, like the big Muslim think tanks. If you're always looking at what's wrong with me and what's missing in me and what I'm not complying with as a Muslim, do you think that you can both build a successful collaboration? I think the answer would be no.
Absolutely. And this is, I mean, to go back to a scholar you quoted in the course of your presentation, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he spoke about fiqh al-awlawiyat, the understanding of priorities for the ummah, and recognizing that certain things have a greater priority when the ummah is being defended as a whole, as is the case when a figure like this comes into the public sphere and is proud to be a Muslim. This is a win, regardless of if he was a non-Muslim saying the same sorts of policies and saying the same sorts of things about Palestine, we would vote for him if we were able to in the New York primary.
Yes.
So, Barakallah Fiki, I think this was actually a very positive and actually a very important note on which to conclude this idea of recognizing that we have some way to go to reach a kind of political maturity as an ummah, which is absolutely essential to achieve ummatic aspirations. And that political maturity is an Islamic imperative, because we will not be able to realize the ummah's goals without sort of that kind of a recognition of what is our priority in a given situation.
100%. And this political maturity, again, is grounded in things like good education, right? Good education in the secular sense and good education in the Islamic sense. Media literacy, digital literacy, and Islamic literacy together. So you need to build this kind of orchestration or this kind of unification between these different streams of knowledge and to bring them all together in an orchestrated way before you start thinking about building, certain institutions or bodies or think tanks that would bring Muslims together. Let's come together first in terms of our thoughts, ideas, political maturity, ability to engage in constructive deliberation and positive dialogue before we think about putting all of that into Muslim think tanks or into organizations. Because if you go the other way around, if you think about building the organization or the think tank, but the seeds of political maturity and intellectual discussion are not there, I don't think that these institutions will go very far.
Let that be a note or a sort of a warning, so to speak, that we pay attention to what really matters at each stage of development, inshallah. And as an ummah, gain that education, gain that nuanced understanding of what is appropriate at a particular time. I've
Absolutely
really benefited, Barakallahu Fiki, from the past 2 hours. Thank you for giving so much of your time. Actually, we've gone slightly over time, but I think it's been a very rich discussion. And
Jazakumullah khair. And Jazakumullah khair once again for inviting me. And I really think that the project Ummatics is very, very important. I think it is crucial. And I wish you and your team, Dr. Usama, inshallah, a lot of success moving forward. And if I can be of any help anytime, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Jazakumullah khairan.
Barakallah Fiki, Dr. Sahar. This has really been eye-opening session for myself and for, I think, all of the very many people who've been attending and have been engaging us through their comments. We are extremely grateful for your time, your insights, your extensive presentation and your extensive engagement in this dialogue. I'm sure we'll have you back, either in a colloquium or in on the website, inshallah, to be contributing to one of our future blog posts. But thank you so much, Barakallah Fiki. And with that, I would like to also thank all of the attendees who've been with us for a little over 2 hours at this point. We hope to be back in a month's time, inshallah, to see you for another colloquium before long. Until then, astawdi'ukumullah, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us tawfiq to our ummatic aspirations. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.